We did it! We've reached the end of 2024. I've got my little Christmas jumper on. Europeans, let me know what you think in the comments. And this is the first in a short series of videos on the best books of this year. As is the case every single year, my top 20 best books of this year is divided into two videos, two lists. 10 international books in translation and 10 books written in English. And today we're starting with the translated books. But just before we dig in, you might have noticed that this video is particularly well lit. And that is thanks to a makeshift lighting setup courtesy of this video's sponsor, Serious Readers. I'm not joking. Ta-da! Serious Readers make serious lights, just like this gorgeous thing. Since my ring light broke a few weeks ago, I have been lighting all my videos using this, and it works so well. And then I take it to the living room, where I use it to read every single book I ever touch. My Serious Light has massively enhanced my reading experience, and that's because Serious Lights use daylight wavelength technology, which replicates the daylight spectrum as closely as technically possible. This floor lamp has a weighted base, it is sturdy, it has a dimmer switch, the light beam can be refocused, and I chose this design, a matte black head and handle with a brass neck. The neck is entirely flexible in any and every direction, and I really don't like reading without this thing beside me. So this Christmas, why not treat yourself or someone you love to your very own Serious Light? Click the link in the description and use the offer code WILLOW24 to get £100 off your own Serious Light. Now I'm gonna need you to go back there and light me up really nice, okay? It doesn't have feet. I have to do this part. There we go. Lovely. On with the video. At number 10, we have Your Utopia by Bora Chung. This was translated from the Korean into English by my dear friend Anton He. Unlike Bora Chung's first short story collection, Cursed Bunny, which was a wild blend of different genres, including fantasy, fairy tales, ghost stories, and science fiction, Your Utopia is very much a sci-fi collection. However, just because this book has narrowed into a specific genre doesn't mean that it sacrifices scale in any way. It still boasts an enormous exploration of genre and theme and style. And what I mean by that is that every single story in Your Utopia explores a different angle, a different theme, or a different idea within the science fiction genre, which means the scope is still absolutely enormous. Bora Chung clearly has an incredible reverence for science fiction and its capacity to tell unique tales, to present warnings about what might happen in our future, to poke and prod at what-if scenarios. It's a wildly inventive work of science fiction, and pretty much everything that the sci-fi genre can do is explored in one way or another across this book. These stories are packed full of political and economic allegories, social dynamics are explored. It kind of feels like the whole sci-fi genre ground up into one short story collection. It's incredible. Now, we all know how professional this channel is, and so I have to confess here that two of the books on this list I don't have physical copies of right now. And that's because I made a careless mistake. I've tried to hide it, but I'm actually in the process of moving house right now, in the lead up to Christmas. Check it out. Half of these shelves are actually bare, and I was really careful about what books I was transporting to my new place. Except I wasn't, because I clearly took away two of the books on this list. At number 9 is Season of the Swamp by Yuri Herrera, translated from the Spanish into English by Lisa Dillman, and since I don't have my copy, why don't I instead hold up a great gift for this Christmas season? My book, Managing and Other Lies by Willow Heath. You want to give yourself and myself a great Christmas present? Buy this on Amazon. Season of the Swamp is a fascinating novella. Yuri Herrera is a Mexican author who lives in New Orleans, and he teaches there at the university. And Season of the Swamp is both a love letter to Mexican history and to the history of the city he now calls home. It is set in the 19th century, and it follows someone who really existed, Benito Juarez, who was Mexico's first indigenous president. But before he became Mexico's first indigenous president, Juarez lived a really interesting life. He was actually exiled from Mexico. He traveled around Europe for several years, and he also spent about 18 months living in New Orleans. And we know nothing about how he spent that time. And so Season of the Swamp is Yuri Herrera filling in the gaps and writing what happened, or what he thinks happened, during those 18 months. Benito Juarez must have met up with other exiles and formed some kind of a plan. The novel has Juarez battle against disease and, most of all, culture shock. He is frightened and confused by the transatlantic slave trade and all of the slaves that are coming through New Orleans. The novella is really short. It's about 100 pages long, and it reads like a fever dream. It is so strangely and beautifully written. The translation by Lisa Dillman is staggeringly gorgeous, so impactful, so rich. And because the novel is so short, you can read it in a single setting, and it really does feel like you are passing through a dream landscape. It's an incredibly impactful work of historical fiction, and also a slightly surreal tinted nightmare thing. I was completely enraptured by this book. At number 8, we have Mammoth by Eva Baltazar, translated from the Catalan by Julia Sanchez. Eva Baltazar's novella Boulder is honestly one of my favourite queer books I've ever read in my life. A dark and dismal sapphic drama. And Mammoth is almost as good. Like Season of the Swamp, this thing is really, really short, but it packs such a punch. The protagonist of Mammoth is a disenchanted young lesbian. When the story begins, she's working at a university, but she soon leaves and starts to live a kind of hedonistic, nomadic lifestyle, moving from place to place, job to job, meeting new people along the way. And one obsession that she has is with getting pregnant. She's absolutely committed to having a baby. And when the book begins, she even sleeps with a man because she will do anything to get pregnant. As the novel goes on, the kinds of relationships she has with the men around her are twisted and strange. As someone who used to move from place to place quite randomly and lived out of a suitcase for about 2 years, I fully and strongly related to the journey that she goes on. And as someone with ADHD who hyperfocuses on things, I also related to how her mind works as well. But the tragedy in her heart, the fact that she's a young gay woman who is willing to sleep with men in order to achieve this one obsession that she has. It is grueling, it is uncomfortable, and it hits so very hard. Mammoth is amazing. At number 7, we have First Love by Ryo Shimamoto. This was translated from the Japanese by Louise Hill Kawai, and wow, this thing is so clever and so satisfying. It is kind of a courtroom drama, at least in its third act. But at its core, it is a psychological character study. It opens with a really tantalizing crime. A young woman was at a job interview at a TV station, and she suddenly left that interview, headed off to her father's place of work where he teaches at a college, lured him into the women's bathroom, and then stabbed him to death. And now we are leading up to the trial. Our protagonist is a psychologist who has been given the opportunity to study this young woman, find out why she did it exactly, and all of the background that leads up to it. Her childhood, her relationship to her dad, her relationship to herself. And as we go along, we learn about our protagonist as well. The moments that are focused on the protagonist, I have to admit, are the least interesting parts of the book. But beyond that, the feminist themes that start to emerge as the book goes on are universal, are powerful, and are really, really important to read about. The crime itself is a strange mystery. There must be so much more truth to this than we first understand. And the young woman who supposedly did it is a really tragic character. I read this book in 2 sittings. I couldn't put it down. It's not technically a murder mystery, but the mystery of it is enough to drive you forward. But what you're really sticking around for is how the novel explores the psychology of a young woman in her situation, and we learn more about that situation as we go on. This is one of my favorite Japanese books of this year, and I was completely glued to it. Just gonna bring my book back out for a second for the other novel that I don't have a copy of right now because because I must have shipped it off to my new flat. And that novel is Not a River by Selva Almada. One of the proudest moments, not just of this year, but of my entire career, was when I interviewed Selva Almada at Topping & Co. in Edinburgh a few months ago. I finally got to meet her and sit with her in front of a sold-out crowd and talk about her incredible fiction. Selva Almada is a genius. Not a River was translated from the Spanish into English by Annie McDermott, and just like all of her books, it is set in her home of Argentina. But Selva Almada specifically grew up in a very rural area of Argentina, and a lot of her books hone in on that rural life. Not a River arguably does that even better than any of her other books. The novel is very much about men and masculinity, and in fact it is part of a kind of thematic trilogy following on from The Wind That Lays Waste and Brickmakers. And Not a River follows three men. They've gone out onto a river out in the countryside to go fishing. Two of the men are old friends, and the third one is the son of a third friend who died. They've taken him out onto the river and they are brutally and savagely attacking the landscape. Typically that's not how we see fishing, but that's how fishing is presented in this novel, and it only gets more intense as it goes on, as they come to meet and spend time talking with the local people, and there are some weird twists that go on with regards to the locals. It's a strange and enigmatic novel at first, but eventually you come to understand that Not a River is about man's relationship to nature and to other people, the lack of respect that men in particular show their surroundings. It's about entitlement, the entitlement that men feel, the idea that men feel like they own everything that's around them, that they are allowed to have whatever they want. Men can just take and take and take, and it is their God-given right to do so. That's what Not a River is really about, and it is so powerful. At number 5 we have The Empusium by Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk. Olga Tokarczuk is one of my all-time favourite authors. Her novels Flights and Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead are utter masterpieces, and the day this book came out I ran to the bookshop to pick it up. Just like Drive Your Plow, The Empusium was translated from Polish into English by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. You wouldn't know that looking at the cover because Fitzcarraldo Editions never put the translator on the cover. I have so many issues with this publishing house, they annoy the shit out of me, but we move. The Empusium is also a feminist novel, but it takes a different approach to that theme. It's a work of historical fiction set in a health resort for men who are struggling with tuberculosis. Our protagonist is a young man who's gone off to the mountains to this health resort to try and get better. One of the first things that happens in this book, and it's pretty traumatic, is that the wife of the health resort's owner dies, apparently by taking her own life. Beyond her, there aren't really any women in this health resort, and in fact, the men, whether they work there or are patients there, spend a lot of time in the evening sitting around smoking cigars, taking a strange drug that they're being given, and talking about how women are physiologically and psychologically beneath men. The novel is also strangely narrated by a very feminine voice, and there are things beyond the health resort, strange things in the forest at its edge. I can't really tell you any more without spoiling things, but this is classified as a horror story. At no point was I scared, but it's very uneasy, and the ways that it explores feminist themes of gender inequality are like nothing I've ever seen before, because nobody writes like Olga Tokarczuk. She is one of the great writers living today. She won the Nobel Prize, and when you read one of her books, you immediately understand why she was given that award. The Empusium is phenomenal. At number 4 we have The Mark by Frida Isberg. This was translated from the Icelandic by Larissa Kaiser, and it is a brilliantly clever political novel. The book is set in the not too distant future, and it follows 4 protagonists. The central concept is that there is a test that is being rolled out in Iceland. It is a test of empathy. You take the test, and if you pass, you are marked as an empathetic and good person, someone who is safe to be around. If you fail the test, well, that means that there's something wrong with you. You are potentially dangerous, unpredictable, unsafe. And ideally, you should be given access to the tools to make yourself better. One of our protagonists is the head of the company that made this test. Another protagonist is the head of a group of men who are protesting against the test. And the central conceit of the novel is that we are days away from a referendum which will decide whether or not this empathy test becomes mandatory for every citizen of Iceland. Right now, it's only being taken by certain public servants, but this referendum could change everything. And as the novel goes on, we see things from different perspectives, and it explores every single angle you could imagine on a topic like this. The novel is undeniably about masculinity, at least in part. A lot of young men are predicted to fail this test, and it asks the question, why? What exactly is this psychological gender divide and age divide? It looks at that question from so many different angles, and I was very, very relieved by that because the book could have had a very aggressive one-sided message, but it doesn't. It is sympathetic. It is so broad in its scope, and I was genuinely floored by how clever its execution is. This is a delicate theme, a delicate topic, and everything is expressed so cleanly and perfectly. The Mark is a phenomenon. At number 3, we have Blood of the Old Kings by Sung-il Kim. This is the second book on this list, translated from the Korean by my friend Anton He. And I almost didn't read this book, but I've been in a real fantasy mood recently. So I picked it up and I was so amazed by what I read. Blood of the Old Kings is pretty fascinating as fantasy books go, because it really artfully and kind of excitedly explores so many classic themes of the fantasy genre. It leans on fun tropes and aesthetics, but it mixes all of that up with very contemporary political allegories. This is very much a Korean novel. It follows 3 protagonists who are all from the same annexed nation. That nation is now under the thumb of a great empire that has conquered so many other smaller countries. And at first, our protagonists don't know each other, but eventually their paths will cross. And in the very first chapter, one of our protagonists climbs into a volcano to talk to a dragon. She has lost her husband and her child, and the dragon was once the great guardian of their nation, but it has basically been in hibernation for 20 years since their nation fell to the empire. And she says to the dragon, "I promise to become the new king and liberate our country from the empire." The dragon agrees to help her. It takes her eye and hands her one of its teeth, which becomes a magic sword that she can use to cut through legions of enemies. Another protagonist is a young university student. She's studying magic, but none of it really means anything because all the university cares about is what happens once these young mages die. Because once you die, you become a battery, which fuels the electricity of the empire. But she's not going to be a battery. She has a voice in her head, a voice that is telling her to go to a certain place and uncover a secret. And she follows the voice. And our third protagonist is a kind of murder mystery protagonist. A friend of his recently died, and he wants to understand who or what killed her and why. Like I said, there are so many tropes at play here, but you can clearly see how this is such a brilliantly sharp political allegory. Honestly, if you're a fantasy fan, you need to check out Blood of the Old Kings. It is an incredibly fun, exhilarating, and powerful work of fantasy fiction. At number 2, we have A Woman of Pleasure by Kyoko Murata. This was translated from the Japanese into English by Juliet Winters Carpenter. It is set around the year 1900, and it follows a young courtesan who has been sold to a brothel in Kumamoto. The novel is kind of lacking in plot, but in a very good way, because A Woman of Pleasure is all about the relationships that are formed between the characters in the brothel. Our protagonist is so young when she arrives. She's from an island far away. She speaks in a strange dialect. When she gets there, she can't really be understood by anyone else. She learns to read and write. She is given opportunities. She is put to work and she doesn't enjoy it, and the physical work that she has to do is uncomfortable, but it is never framed as a tragedy. Rather, she takes this life that she's been forced into as an opportunity to grow and learn and make friends. A revolution is coming. There is a rise of the proletariat kind of vibe and theme to this book that amps up towards the end, and it is really, really exciting. But ultimately, it's the sense of community that this book emphasizes which I loved most of all. The relationships that our protagonist builds with the other women in the brothel. It's engaging, it's uplifting, it doesn't whitewash anything or downplay what they have to go through, the things they're forced to do to and by men, but loving one another, forming friendships, finding joy. These things are an act of resistance, and that's what the book is really honing in on. Joy as an act of resistance, which I'm sure is the name of an Idols album. Anyway, my #1 book in translation of 2024 is Aftershock by Chinese author Zhang Ling. This remarkably powerful character drama was translated from the Chinese into English by Shelley Bryant. I read this thing early in the year and it has stuck with me in a way that so few books manage to do. It's a story that's kind of told in reverse. We begin in the modern day in Toronto, where our protagonist now lives with her family, who emigrated there from China some years ago. Our protagonist, Xiao Deng, is an accomplished writer, and the first place that we see her is in a psychiatrist's office. She is struggling with her marriage and her relationship to her daughter. Soon after, we are flung back in time, not just to her childhood, but even earlier than that, to her own mother's youth. We learn about what it was like for her mother growing up through the Cultural Revolution, how she met Xiao Deng's father, and how the two of them built a life together. The life they built, however, was in the city of Tangshan, which is not too far from Beijing, and in the 1970s it was hit with a devastating earthquake. This really happened. By the time the earthquake hit, Xiao Deng was a young girl, and the earthquake was a catalyst for what happened to her next, but I don't want to spoil that. Where Xiao Deng goes from here is really remarkable. It is heartbreaking and incredible. The story that this short novel tells, from her mother growing up through the Cultural Revolution to her becoming a successful author who moves to Canada, it is staggering. So much ground is covered, and on every inch of that ground is painted a vivid picture of a life, the relationships that she built, the work that she did, the people she met, the bonds that she forged, the traumas and anxieties that she went through. This is one of the most special novels I've ever read. Special is a kind of nebulous word, but trust me when I say that Aftershock is really remarkable. It is absolutely one of my favorite Chinese novels, and not enough people are reading it. I can't help but bring that up. Aftershock is not being talked about enough. You're not going to see it on any other best of year lists. You're not going to see it in bookshops. You're not going to see it recommended enough. And so I really hope that I can do my job here in telling you that Aftershock is a must-read work of Chinese fiction and is my favorite novel in translation of 2024. It is astonishing. An absolute masterpiece of Chinese fiction in translation. And that brings us to the end of the first of 2 best of year lists for 2024. Come back in a few days for my best books in English of 2024. And after that, something different. Merry Christmas from me and my little jumper, and subscribe for books.